The three wealthy heirs of the Lancaster family mocked a poor strawberry seller on the streets, laughing at her ragged clothes and struggling business. But when their father saw her, his face went pale, because the girl they had just insulted wasn't just anyone. She was the sister they had lost 15 years ago, and what happened next would change everything. The luxury car pulled up to the bustling street market, its sleek black exterior standing out like royalty among peasants. Inside sat the three heirs of the Lancaster Empire, Damien, Adrian, and Leo, rich, powerful, and arrogant. They had everything: private jets, mansions, billion-dollar investments. The world bent to their will. And today, they were here to amuse themselves. Why did father send us to this filthy place? Leo scoffed, adjusting his designer watch. Adrian smirked. Some kind of business deal. He wants us to understand real people. Damien, the eldest, rolled his eyes. Let's just get this over with. As they stepped out of the car, the scent of ripe fruit and fresh bread filled the air. People bustled past them, too busy with their lives to notice the wealthy men in their midst, until they saw her. A girl, barely in her 20s, sat behind a small wooden stall stacked with fresh strawberries. Her hands were stained red from sorting them. Her simple dress was worn, patched in places, her hair tied back in a messy braid. She looked out of place, not because she didn't belong here, but because she carried herself like she did. Leo sneered. Look at this one. Adrian smirked, nudging Damien. Think she's ever seen a $100 bill? Damien chuckled, stepping closer. What's the price, strawberry girl? The girl looked up, her bright hazel eyes locking onto his. $2 a basket? She said simply. Adrian scoffed. $2? That's less than what I tip my driver. Leo laughed. Maybe if you smiled more, you'd sell faster. The girl's jaw tightened, but she didn't lower her eyes. Damien smirked, picking up a strawberry and inspecting it. You know, he mused, it's funny. A girl like you, struggling like this. What did you do to deserve such a miserable life? Silence. Then the girl spoke, her voice calm but sharp. I was stolen from my family. The brothers froze. Her tone was steady, but her eyes held something deeper. Pain, loss, and something else. A truth they weren't ready for. For a moment, everything went silent. Damien, Adrian, and Leo exchanged confused glances. Stolen? Leo scoffed, crossing his arms. What kind of story is that? The girl's jaw tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked them dead in the eye. I don't need you to believe me, she said, but I know what happened. Damien raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. All right, then, he said lazily. Enlighten us. What tragic tale are you selling along with these strawberries? The girl exhaled sharply, as if this wasn't the first time someone had mocked her pain. But she didn't back down. I was taken from my family when I was 5, she said. I don't remember much, just fire, smoke, and a man's voice telling me to be quiet. Adrian's smirk faltered. Damien's fingers curled slightly. The girl continued. I woke up in a stranger's house, told that I was unwanted, abandoned, that my family never looked for me. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with something raw. I spent years believing I was nothing, that I didn't belong anywhere. Leo rolled his eyes. And you expect us to care? Adrian chuckled, shaking off the strange tension in the air. Tragic, really. But what does that have to do with us? The girl let out a soft, bitter laugh. Then she said something that made their blood run cold. Because the family I was stolen from was the Lancasters. Silence. A sharp, deafening silence. The air between them shifted. Damien's body went rigid. Adrian's smirk vanished. Leo paled. "You're lying," Damien said, his voice dangerously low. The girl looked him straight in the eye. "Am I?" Adrian forced a laugh, but it was hollow. "You expect us to believe that you, some street vendor, are a Lancaster?" The girl raised an eyebrow. "Believe what you want, but I know the truth." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, something old and worn. She placed it on the wooden stall between them. A locket. Golden. Slightly scratched from time. And when Damien saw it, his heart nearly stopped. Because he knew that locket. He had seen it before, 15 years ago, around the neck of a little girl, their sister. His hands clenched into fists. His mind screamed, "It's not possible," but deep down, something inside him whispered, "It is." Damien's breath hitched. His fingers itched to reach for the locket, the one thing that shattered all doubt. He had seen it before, 15 years ago, a tiny golden locket that once hung around the neck of a little girl with bright hazel eyes. The little sister who had vanished. The memory flooded back like a storm, a fire, smoke, panic, their father's desperate shouts, their mother's screams. And then she was gone. Adrian and Leo stood frozen beside him, their faces drained of color. Leo opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Adrian finally snapped out of his shock. "Where did you get that?" His voice was sharp, demanding. The girl, their sister, didn't flinch. "I've had it all my life," she said. "It's the only thing I had when they found me." Damien swallowed hard. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a scam, a setup, some con artist looking for money. This was real. And suddenly everything felt wrong. They had insulted her, mocked her, humiliated her, their own sister. Leo let out a shaky breath. This isn't possible. You can't be her. Our sister, she's dead." The girl's expression remained calm, but her voice wavered. "I thought I was dead too," she whispered. The weight of her words hit them like a punch. Damien clenched his jaw. His mind was screaming, "This can't be happening," but deep down, he knew. The resemblance, the locket, the fire. It was her. It was really her. Adrian grabbed Damien's arm. "What do we do?" he whispered. For the first time in years, he sounded lost. Damien didn't answer. He couldn't, because right at that moment, a black luxury car screeched to a stop behind them. The door flung open, and a man stepped out. Their father. The moment his eyes landed on the girl, his entire body went rigid. And then, his face went pale. His lips trembled as he whispered one word. "Sophia." The girl's breath caught. Her eyes filled with tears. And in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Dad?" The street fell silent. Damien, Adrian, and Leo stood frozen, their father's raw, trembling voice still echoing in their ears. "Sophia?" The girl, Sophia, stared at him, her hazel eyes glistening with unshed tears. The father she thought she had lost forever was standing right in front of her. Mr. Lancaster's breath shook as he took a slow, hesitant step forward. His usually imposing figure. The man who controlled empires, made billion-dollar deals without blinking, looked fragile for the first time in his life. His eyes never left Sophia. "It's you," he whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Sophia's lips trembled. She took a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the locket. I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Am I?" Mr. Lancaster's face crumpled. His strong hands, the same ones that once lifted her up as a child, shook violently. He turned to his sons. "Tell me this is real," he demanded, his voice breaking. "Tell me this isn't some cruel joke." Damien swallowed hard. His father, the man who had always been a fortress of power and control, was on the verge of collapsing. "It's real," Damien said quietly. His throat was dry. "She has the locket." Adrian ran a hand through his hair, still struggling to process what was happening. "Dad, she said she was taken during the fire." Leo, the one who always had something to say, was completely speechless. Mr. Lancaster staggered forward, his breath shallow. "Sophia," he choked out, "come here." Sophia hesitated. For years she had dreamed of this moment, of finding out who she was, of knowing where she belonged. But now that she was standing in front of them, she was terrified. "What if," she whispered, looking down, "what if I'm not who you think I am?" Mr. Lancaster's face hardened. "I know my daughter." His voice was stronger now, certain. "I know those eyes, that locket." His hands trembled as he reached for her, as if afraid she'd disappear again. Sophia's breath hitched. Then her walls crumbled. She threw herself into his arms. A deep, ragged sob tore through Mr. Lancaster's chest as he held her for the first time in 15 years. "My little girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I lost you forever." Sophia clung to him, shaking, and for the first time in her life, she finally felt like she belonged. Damien, Adrian, and Leo stood there, watching their father cry like a broken man. And as they looked at the sister they had mocked only minutes ago, guilt hit them like a freight train. They had called her poor, worthless, and all along, she was one of them. Damien, Adrian, and Leo stood motionless, watching their father break down in a way they had never seen before. Sophia buried her face in his chest, her small frame shaking as years of pain, loneliness, and unanswered questions flooded out of her in sobs. Mr. Lancaster held on to her tightly, as if afraid she'd disappear again. "I searched for you," he whispered, his voice raw. "For years, I never stopped." Sophia clutched his coat, her fingers gripping the fabric like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. "But I stopped searching for you," she whispered back. "I thought you never wanted me." Her father stiffened. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his expression full of agony. "Who told you that?" Sophia hesitated. Damien, Adrian, and Leo watched closely, their own emotions in turmoil. Finally, she swallowed hard. "The people who took me." Their father's expression darkened. "Who were they?" His voice was no longer just filled with pain, but with anger. Sophia wiped her tears, taking a deep breath. "I don't know their names," she admitted. "I was so little. I just remember being in different houses, different faces." She paused. "And I remember one thing. They always told me my family had left me, that I was unwanted." A sharp, painful silence followed. Damien felt his stomach twist, because just minutes ago they had treated her the exact same way. He clenched his fists, his own guilt crushing him. Adrian's jaw tightened, his usual arrogance completely wiped away. Leo looked down, shame burning through him. Mr. Lancaster closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were filled with fire. "Whoever did this to you," he said, his voice ice cold, "will pay." Sophia believed him. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't alone. She wasn't lost. She was a Lancaster. And as she looked at her 3 brothers, the same ones who had insulted her, mocked her, laughed at her, she saw the realization settle in their eyes. She saw their regret. Leo was the first to step forward, his usual confidence now replaced with shame. He swallowed hard. "We treated you horribly." Adrian nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "We didn't know. But that's not an excuse." Damien, the oldest, the one who had always been the leader, took a deep breath. Then, for the first time in his life, he said something he had never had to say before. "We were wrong," he admitted, his voice firm but sincere. "And if you'll let us, we'll spend the rest of our lives making it up to you." Sophia stared at them for a long moment. Then she smiled. Because after 15 years of being lost, she had finally been found. And this time she wasn't going anywhere.